Under the quiet night sky, an elderly black man drove slowly along a wide, empty road. His car was not new, but it was well kept, polished so that the streetlights reflected on its surface. He sat tall and steady in the driver's seat, his posture calm, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He had just left a community event where he had spoken about law, justice, and the need for patience in a world full of tension. His voice still echoed in his mind, reminding him of the many people who had thanked him for his wisdom. At his age, he carried himself with dignity, and he wore a simple dark suit with a tie, neat but not flashy. The night was quiet until a sudden flash of red and blue filled his rear-view mirror. The sound of a siren cut through the silence. The man looked back and saw a police cruiser speeding toward him. He sighed softly, more with disappointment than fear. He carefully signaled, slowed the car, and pulled to the side of the road. He knew the procedure well, and he always handled such situations with calm. The officer stepped out of the patrol car with a sharpness in his movements. He was young, his posture stiff, his jaw set in a way that showed more pride than wisdom. His hand rested on his belt as if ready for a fight, though none existed. He approached the car quickly, shining a flashlight into the man's window. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone clipped and cold. The elderly man reached calmly into his coat pocket and took out his wallet. He handed over his license and spoke in a soft, respectful voice. "Of course, officer. Is there a reason I was stopped tonight?" The officer frowned. "You were driving slow in this neighborhood. That seems suspicious." The man raised his eyebrows slightly, but he didn't argue. "I was just taking my time. I have no need to rush." His voice was steady, almost gentle, but the officer's eyes narrowed as if searching for a reason not to trust him. Instead of returning to his patrol car, the officer kept standing by the window. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. His voice carried authority, but also something heavier, an assumption, a judgment made too quickly. The man did not resist. With quiet grace, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped onto the road slowly, his movements careful because of his age, but still filled with dignity. He stood in front of the officer, straight-backed, his eyes calm but firm. "What are you doing out here this late?" the officer asked, his voice rising as if he needed to prove his control. "I'm on my way home," the man answered simply. His words carried no anger. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He had spent his life in courtrooms, listening to heated debates, guiding decisions with patience. This moment, though unpleasant, was one he knew how to handle, with control, not fire. The officer shined his flashlight at the man's suit and shoes, searching for anything that could give him reason to press further. He muttered under his breath, "Doesn't look like you belong around here." The elderly man caught the words but didn't respond. Instead, he stood quietly, his hands by his side, his face calm. His silence seemed to bother the officer even more. "Do you live here?" the officer pressed. "I live a short drive away," the man replied. "I often take this road." The officer walked around the car, peering inside through the windows. He saw nothing unusual, just a briefcase on the passenger seat, a stack of papers neatly arranged, and a folded umbrella. Still, he circled back, his suspicion untouched. By now, a couple of cars had slowed as they passed, their drivers glancing curiously at the scene. The flashing police lights painted the street in sharp colors, drawing attention in the stillness of the night. The officer crossed his arms, clearly unsatisfied. "Wait here," he said sharply. He walked back to his patrol car, muttering into his radio. The elderly man remained standing by his own car, patient, steady. He had been through far bigger tests in his life. He had argued before courts, had studied laws late into the night, had faced people who underestimated him simply because of his age or appearance. This moment was not new. It was just another test of his patience and strength. As the minutes passed, a small group of pedestrians who had been walking nearby stopped to watch. They whispered among themselves. One of them pulled out a phone and began recording, sensing that something unusual was happening. The elderly man noticed but didn't mind. He simply clasped his hands in front of him, waiting with quiet strength. The officer returned after a while, his frown deeper. "You're clear," he said, "but I still don't like this. You don't look like someone who belongs here at this time." The words hung heavy in the night. They were not about the law, not about safety. They were about something unspoken but obvious. The elderly man finally spoke with a tone that was slightly firmer, though still calm. "Officer, I am a citizen. I have followed the law, given you what you asked, and treated you with respect. I trust that will be returned." The officer didn't respond right away. He looked at the man again, searching for some weakness, some reason to justify his suspicion. But the man stood there steady, unshaken. The crowd whispered louder now. "Why is he being treated this way?" one person asked. Another shook their head, recording every second. The officer glanced nervously at the bystanders, aware that eyes were on him. But pride held him firm. "Stay where you are," he said again, as if repeating his command would make his judgment correct. The elderly man simply nodded. He was not here to argue. He knew that sometimes silence was stronger than shouting. Inside, he was thinking about how quickly judgment can blind people, how easily authority can be misused when it is guided by assumption instead of truth. The night stretched on. The flashing lights continued to reflect against the houses nearby. The elderly man stood with dignity, waiting while the officer remained restless, unsure of what he was really searching for. In that still moment, the stage was set for what was to come. Neither the officer nor the crowd knew the truth about who this man really was. To them, he was just another driver pulled over on a quiet street. But beneath his calm face and patient silence was an identity that carried immense power, an identity that would soon change everything. The night held its breath, waiting for the reveal that would come in the next moments, the reveal that would turn this simple traffic stop into a story remembered far beyond this street. The air around the scene grew heavier as the minutes stretched on. The flashing red and blue lights from the police car continued to spill across the street, painting nearby houses and cars in sharp, restless colors. The elderly black man stood quietly by his own vehicle, his back straight, his hands calm at his sides. His face showed patience, but there was also a firmness in his eyes. He was no stranger to long waits or unfair treatment. His life had taught him that silence and dignity could sometimes carry more power than anger. The young officer, however, seemed restless. He paced a few steps back and forth, holding the man's license in his hand, muttering things into his radio. Each time he glanced at the man, his expression carried suspicion, as though he was still searching for something wrong, even after finding nothing. A couple more pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk. They whispered among themselves, pointing to the scene. One of them held up a phone, recording steadily. Another whispered, "Why is he making that man stand outside the car? He didn't do anything." The crowd was small but growing, curiosity pulling people toward the flashing lights. The officer finally returned to the elderly man. Instead of ending the stop, he crossed his arms and asked in a sharp tone, "So where exactly are you going tonight? Who are you meeting out here this late?" The man's voice was even and calm. "I'm returning home from an event. I was invited to speak there earlier. I'm not meeting anyone. I am simply on my way home." The officer narrowed his eyes. "What event?" "A community gathering," the man replied. "We spoke about history, law, and the importance of fairness." The officer scoffed slightly, as if dismissing the answer. His voice rose sharp enough that the nearby bystanders could hear. "That doesn't explain why you're driving so slow. Most people don't cruise through neighborhoods like that at night." The man looked at him with steady eyes. "Officer, I was in no hurry. There was no danger in driving carefully." The officer took a step closer, shining his flashlight again into the man's face as if he were trying to find something hidden there. "Careful, huh? Or are you hiding something?" His words carried a weight of assumption. The elderly man did not flinch. He simply answered with quiet strength, "I have nothing to hide." But the officer was not satisfied. He gestured toward the car. "Open the trunk." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression calm, though his patience was being tested. Still, he nodded. He walked slowly to the back of the car and pressed the button to unlock the trunk. The lid lifted smoothly, revealing what was inside. Just a neat, organized space with a folded coat, a leather briefcase, and an umbrella. Nothing unusual. The officer shined his flashlight inside, rummaging through the neat items as if he expected to find something dangerous. He found nothing, yet his pride did not allow him to admit he had been wrong. By now, a second police car arrived. 2 more officers stepped out, their radios crackling at their sides. They looked at the scene with curiosity and then at the elderly man, who remained standing with quiet dignity. "What do we have here?" one of them asked. "Suspicious driver," the first officer said quickly. "Slow driving, odd behavior. Doesn't seem to belong around here." The two new officers glanced at the man. One of them frowned slightly as if confused. "He doesn't look dangerous," he said softly. But the first officer brushed it off and ordered, "Let's keep this secure. We don't know who he really is." The man listened to their words without interrupting. He had been in enough courtrooms to know when people spoke without evidence. He folded his hands together in front of him and waited, his silence more powerful than any argument. The crowd had grown larger now. More people stopped to watch, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Several phones were raised, recording every detail. A few voices from the sidewalk called out, "He's done nothing wrong." "Let him go." The officer turned to glare at the bystanders. "Stay back," he barked. This is police business, but the people did not leave. Their murmurs only grew louder. The flashing lights, the raised voices, and the image of an old man standing outside his car drew more eyes. The elderly man finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, I have given you my license, my registration, and my cooperation. I have opened my trunk. I have answered your questions. Tell me, what law have I broken tonight?" His question was simple, yet it carried weight. The bystanders fell quiet for a moment, listening for the officer's reply. But the officer did not answer directly. Instead, he grew frustrated. "Don't get smart with me," he said sharply. "You think you're above the law?" The old man looked him in the eye, steady as stone. "No one is above the law," he said slowly. "That includes me, and it includes you." Those words struck a chord in the air. The crowd reacted, murmuring louder now, some even clapping softly. The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening. He had not expected such calm defiance, and it unsettled him. One of the backup officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure about how far this was going. But the first officer pressed on. He pulled out a notepad and began scribbling. "Maybe I should write you up for resisting, or for obstructing." The elderly man shook his head gently. "I have resisted nothing. I have obeyed every order. I am simply standing here." Again the crowd reacted, nodding in agreement. The young officer glanced at them, his pride clashing with the reality of so many eyes on him. His hands twitched slightly at his belt, as if he wanted to show authority through force. But he stopped himself. The elderly man's patience, his calm tone, and his unshaken dignity made the officer feel smaller, though he would never admit it. Pride pushed him to go further. "Put your hands behind your back," the officer ordered suddenly. "You're coming with me until we figure this out." Gasps rose from the crowd. Several people shouted, "He didn't do anything." The phones recorded closely now, capturing every word, every movement. The elderly man took a slow breath. His face remained calm, but his eyes grew firmer. He turned slightly toward the crowd, then back to the officer. His voice was low but steady. "Be careful, officer. The law you serve is watching you as closely as these people are." The words hung in the night like a warning, though not spoken with anger, only with truth. The young officer hesitated, caught between his pride and his growing unease. He did not know who this man was, but something about the way he spoke, the calm authority in his tone, hinted that he was no ordinary driver. Still, blinded by his own assumptions, the officer pressed forward. He waved to the backup officers, signaling them to move closer. They obeyed reluctantly, their faces uneasy. The elderly man stood tall, his dignity unshaken. Though his hands were still free, he carried himself like someone who had spent his life standing for truth. His silence now was heavier than any argument. The scene was no longer just a traffic stop. It had become a test, not just for the elderly man's patience, but for the very meaning of justice under flashing lights and restless eyes. The night waited, tense and expectant for the moment when truth would rise above pride. The flashing lights still washed over the quiet street, making the scene feel larger than life. By now the crowd of bystanders had grown. Some people stood on the sidewalk whispering. Others filmed with their phones, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. They could see clearly that the elderly black man had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated as if he were a threat. The man himself stood calm, tall, and unshaken. His silence carried weight. His eyes were steady, and his voice, whenever he chose to speak, was controlled and respectful. The young officer who had stopped him was restless. He walked back and forth, his notepad in hand, glancing between the man and the watching crowd. His pride was burning. He had expected this stop to be quick, simple, and full of his own authority. Instead, he was beginning to feel the pressure of dozens of eyes on him. His commands, his suspicion, and his behavior were being captured on camera. Still, instead of backing down, he decided to push harder. "Put your hands behind your back," the officer said again, louder this time. "You're resisting a lawful stop." The elderly man raised his voice slightly, though it was still calm. "Officer, I have not resisted. I have followed each of your orders. The people here are watching. They know the truth," the crowd murmured louder, their voices rising like a wave. Some called out, "He's right. He hasn't done anything." Others shook their heads and said, "This is wrong." The backup officers looked uneasy. They exchanged glances, their body language showing hesitation. One of them whispered, "This doesn't feel right," but the first officer ignored him. His pride was now leading him, not reason. The elderly man clasped his hands in front of him and asked once more, "Tell me, officer, what crime have I committed? What law have I broken?" The question was clear, simple, and powerful. The officer had no answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his silence louder than any reply. Instead of admitting the truth, he snapped back, "Don't talk back to me. You're making this harder for yourself." The man did not move. His stillness, his refusal to be shaken, made the officer's authority feel smaller. It was as if the roles were shifting. The one giving orders seemed nervous while the one being questioned stood as steady as stone. One of the backup officers finally stepped closer. "Maybe we should let him go," he said softly. "There's nothing here. He's been fully cooperative." The young officer glared at his colleague. "Stay out of it." "I know what I'm doing." The tension thickened. The crowd grew bolder now. "Why are you doing this to him?" one woman shouted. Another man called out, "He's somebody important. Look at the way he carries himself." Those words hung in the air. It was true. There was something about the elderly man's posture, his dignity, his calmness, that made people think he was more than just another driver. His voice carried weight, like someone used to being listened to in important places. The officer, however, refused to listen. His pride wouldn't allow it. He pointed at the car and said, "Search the whole thing. Open the doors." The elderly man looked at him with steady eyes. "You have already searched my trunk. There is nothing to find." But the officer motioned to his colleagues anyway. Reluctantly, one of them opened the car door. Inside was the same neat briefcase, the same papers, the same folded umbrella. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. The crowd laughed softly now, shaking their heads. "He told you there was nothing," someone said. The young officer felt his pride sting deeper. Every second that passed made him look less in control. He needed to prove his authority, but every attempt only revealed his weakness. The elderly man took a slow breath. His voice grew firmer, though still calm. "Officer, you are crossing a line. I am not your enemy. I am a man on his way home. Do you not see that?" For the first time, the officer hesitated. He looked into the man's eyes and saw no fear, no panic, no guilt, only strength. But pride is a heavy weight, and it pulled him again. "Enough talking," he snapped. "Turn around." The backup officers moved closer, but their hesitation was clear. They were uncomfortable, their eyes darting between the man, the crowd, and their colleague. None of them wanted to be the one to put hands on this man. Something told them that this situation was not ordinary. The elderly man finally spoke words that cut through the air like a bell. "Officer, the law is bigger than your badge, and the law will always outlast pride." The crowd gasped softly, struck by the power of those words. The officer froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. He felt as though he had been challenged, but in a way that revealed truth instead of disrespect. The man then folded his hands behind his back willingly, not because he was guilty, but because he wanted to show he had nothing to hide. His calmness made the officer's aggression look even more unreasonable. "Do what you must," the man said softly, "but know that you are being watched, not only by these people but by the law itself." The crowd erupted now, voices louder, firmer. "Yes, he's right. Let him go. This is injustice." The officer's hands trembled slightly. He had wanted control, but now he was losing it in front of everyone. Each second that passed chipped away at the image of authority he had tried to build. Then someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "I think I know who he is." Heads turned. "He looks familiar. Isn't he?" The words faded, but the spark was lit. People began murmuring to one another, guessing, connecting the man's face with news stories, with important speeches, with moments they had seen on television. The officer heard the whispers, and unease filled his chest. He had thought this man was just another driver. But what if he wasn't? What if he was someone far more important than he had imagined? The backup officers stepped back slightly, uncertainty growing in their faces. One of them whispered again, "We need to be careful." The elderly man said nothing more. His silence was louder now than any speech. He simply stood there, his back straight, his face calm, as though he knew the moment of truth was close. The crowd pressed in closer, their whispers turning into certainty. Phones recorded from every angle. The young officer could feel the weight of eyes, the pull of doubt, and the sting of his own pride. The night had shifted. What had started as a simple stop was no longer small. It was becoming a story that would reach far beyond that street. And the man at the center of it, quiet, patient, unshaken, was about to reveal a truth that no one there could have imagined. The air grew still again, the kind of silence that comes right before something changes. The young officer swallowed hard, unaware that he was only steps away from the moment that would turn his actions into history. The crowd grew larger, the flashing lights bouncing off faces filled with concern and curiosity. People whispered, pointed, and recorded. The elderly black man stood tall, silent, and composed, even as the officer's pride pushed the situation further. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, his eyes sharp, but beneath that sharpness was uncertainty. He had expected obedience, fear, or excuses. Instead, he faced calmness that felt unshakable. "Turn around," the officer barked again, though his voice cracked slightly. The old man slowly looked at him, his eyes steady, but not harsh. "Officer, I have given you everything you asked for. License, registration, my trunk, my answers. And yet you still ask for more?" The officer clenched his jaw. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A woman's voice rang out, "Why won't you let him go?" "He's innocent." Another man added, "We're recording everything. The whole world is going to see this." The officer's hands twitched. His pride told him to press forward, but his mind began to realize the weight of what was happening. Still, pride is a stubborn chain, and it pulled him again. "Enough talk," he snapped, stepping closer. The elderly man reached calmly into his suit pocket. The officer froze instantly, his hand darting toward his holster. The crowd gasped. But the old man's movements were slow, deliberate, and full of control. He carefully pulled out a black leather wallet and opened it. Inside was an identification card, small but powerful. The man held it up with quiet authority. "Do you know what this is, officer?" he asked softly. The officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing. And then he saw it. The golden seal of the United States Supreme Court shining under the flashlight. The officer blinked, his face draining of color. The crowd close enough to see erupted in shock. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, he's a judge!" Another voice added, "Not just a judge, a Supreme Court justice." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Phones zoomed in on the ID card, capturing the truth. The man standing silently, treated like a suspect, was one of the highest judges in the country. The officer stumbled back a step, his hand dropping from his belt. His lips parted, but no words came out. The backup officers froze in place, their eyes wide. They had been seconds away from handcuffing a Supreme Court justice. The elderly man closed his wallet slowly and returned it to his pocket. His voice was calm, but now it carried a weight that made the air itself heavy. "You said I do not belong here." "But I belong not just here, I belong in every corner of this country because I serve its highest law." The crowd cheered loudly now, clapping and shouting. "Yes, that's right. Shame on you." Their voices filled the street. The young officer's pride shattered into silence. He looked at the man before him, realizing the depth of his mistake. The backup officers stepped back, lowering their hands, their faces pale with embarrassment. One whispered, "We messed up." The justice did not gloat. He did not raise his voice or scold. He simply stood tall, his dignity shining brighter than the flashing lights. He looked at the young officer with calm eyes and said, "Respect should never depend on appearances. The law you swore to protect demands better." Those words cut deeper than anger ever could. The young officer swallowed hard, his face burning under the gaze of the crowd. He tried to speak but only managed, I didn't know." The justice nodded slowly. That is the problem. You judged before you knew. You assumed before you listened. The crowd roared in agreement. People shouted, "Listen to him." This is justice speaking. The moment had shifted entirely. The power was no longer in the officer's hands. It was in the truth, the identity, and the calm authority of the man he had tried to humiliate. The backup officers, ashamed, stepped back toward their car. They wanted no part in the mess that had unfolded. The first officer, however, stood frozen, caught between shame and disbelief. The justice took a step closer, not in aggression, but in dignity. "I do not need your apology tonight," he said firmly. "But I hope you remember this moment every time you wear that uniform." The officer's eyes dropped. He could not look the man in the eye. His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." The justice turned toward the crowd then, acknowledging them with a small nod. The people clapped, some with tears in their eyes. They had witnessed arrogance crumble and dignity rise. A man in the crowd shouted, "This is going viral," and waved his phone. The justice only smiled faintly and said, "Truth has its own way of spreading." The flashing lights now seemed weaker compared to the glow of respect surrounding the justice. He walked calmly back to his car, his posture straight, his dignity unshaken. He opened the door, placed his briefcase neatly inside, and sat down slowly. The officer stood frozen, still holding the notepad he had scribbled on earlier. It now looked meaningless in his hand. The backup officers quietly retreated to their car, avoiding the eyes of the crowd. Before starting the engine, the justice rolled down his window. He looked once more at the young officer and said, "The law is not a weapon to display power. It is a shield to protect the weak and the innocent. Remember that." The officer nodded, his face pale. The justice drove away slowly, his car disappearing into the night. But the lesson he left behind stayed heavy in the air. The crowd remained on the sidewalk, buzzing with excitement and disbelief. "Can you believe that?" "A Supreme Court justice," someone said. Another added, "And he stayed so calm the whole time." That's real strength. Phones buzzed as videos uploaded instantly to social media. Within minutes, the story began spreading beyond the street, beyond the city. The world was about to see what had happened here tonight. The young officer returned to his patrol car, sitting in silence. His pride was gone, replaced by the sinking weight of his mistake. He knew that his career, his reputation, and his choices would never be seen the same way again. The night that had begun with flashing lights ended with a truth brighter than any siren. Dignity cannot be silenced, and justice cannot be humiliated. The following morning, the city woke up to a storm of news. Videos recorded by bystanders had spread overnight across every platform. Clips of the elderly black man standing tall and calm, his wallet opening to reveal the golden seal of the United States Supreme Court, were watched by millions within hours. Headlines filled the screens. Supreme Court justice pulled over and humiliated by police. Some news stations ran the story on repeat, showing the calm dignity of the justice and the stunned face of the officer side by side. In the quiet of his home, the justice sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea. He had lived long enough to know how quickly stories could travel in the modern world. He had not wanted attention. He had not spoken to shame anyone. But truth has a way of shining, even when one does not seek the spotlight. He looked out the window at the rising sun and thought about the lessons of the night before. Not for himself, but for the country that had watched. Meanwhile, at the police department, the young officer walked into the station with a heavy heart. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some shook their heads, others avoided his gaze. The chief called him into the office. On the desk sat a printed newspaper, the front page filled with his picture next to the justice. The chief's voice was stern but not loud. "Do you understand what you have done? This is not just about one man. This is about judgment, respect in the face of this department." The officer swallowed hard. "I didn't know who he was," he whispered. "That's the point," the chief replied sharply. "Respect is not given only to those with titles. It is owed to everyone." The officer lowered his head, shame heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in his career, he realized the difference between authority and wisdom. Authority had made him loud, but wisdom had made the justice silent and strong. Back in the city, people gathered at coffee shops, offices, and living rooms to talk about the story. Some spoke about injustice, others about the calm strength of the justice. Many said they admired how he never raised his voice. never lost his composure even when treated unfairly. In schools, teachers showed the video to students, asking them what they learned from it. Children raised their hands and said things like, "He stayed calm, and he didn't fight back, but he spoke the truth." The story became more than a headline, it became a lesson. Later that week, the justice returned quietly to his courtroom. He walked through the grand halls past clerks and lawyers who now looked at him with even deeper respect. He carried no pride in what had happened. He had no interest in fame. For him, the event was simply another reminder of the work still left to do in the nation, work to ensure fairness, dignity, and justice for all. During a recess, one of his colleagues asked him, "Why didn't you reveal who you were earlier?" "You could have ended the stop at once," the justice smiled gently, "because titles should not be the shield. Respect should not depend on power. If I had shown my badge at the beginning, the lesson would have been lost." Those words spread quietly among his peers, adding to the respect he already carried. Meanwhile, the videos continued to shape conversations across the country. People debated about policing, respect, and the danger of assumptions. Some defended the officer, saying he was young and inexperienced. Others insisted that ignorance was no excuse. But most agreed on one thing: the justice's calmness had shown what true strength looked like. The young officer, placed on administrative leave, spent his days in reflection. At night, he replayed the scene in his mind, the calm voice, the powerful words, the heavy silence that had made him feel so small. At first, he had thought it was humiliation, but as days passed, he began to see it differently. It was not humiliation, it was correction. The justice had given him a gift he had not understood in the moment, a chance to change. Weeks later, the officer wrote a letter. It was not demanded by anyone, but he felt it in his heart. The letter was long, filled with apology, but more than that, filled with lessons he had learned. He admitted his pride, his assumptions, and his mistakes, and he ended with words that showed growth. "Respect should never wait for a title. From this day I will serve differently." The justice received the letter quietly. He read it in his study, the sunlight falling across his desk. He did not smile, but he nodded. Perhaps he thought the lesson had reached where it needed to. Months later, the story was still remembered. Not as a tale of shame, but as a turning point. People would recall the night an elderly man, pulled over and humiliated, revealed himself to be one of the highest judges in the land. They would remember how he did not shout, did not demand, did not punish, but instead showed dignity that outshone flashing lights. In time, the story became an example in training rooms for new police officers. In classrooms, it became a discussion about judgment and fairness. In families, it became a story parents told their children about patience, truth, and respect. For the justice himself, life returned to its steady rhythm. He continued to hear cases, write opinions, and guide justice with wisdom. But sometimes when he sat quietly in his home, he thought about that night, not with anger, not with pride, but with hope, that the lesson carried by his calmness had planted seeds of change. On one quiet evening, as he walked in his garden, a neighbor approached him. The neighbor said softly, "We're proud of you, not because you are a justice, but because you reminded us what dignity looks like." The justice smiled, his eyes gentle. "Dignity is not mine alone," he said. "It belongs to everyone who chooses patience over anger, truth over pride, and respect over judgment." The neighbor nodded, moved by the words. The justice returned to his garden, his steps steady, his spirit calm. The story had begun with flashing lights and harsh words, but it ended with truth shining brighter than sirens, dignity stronger than pride, and a reminder that respect must never depend on titles. It must live in every heart, for every person. And so, the lesson of that night lived on, not just in videos, not just in headlines, but in the quiet choices of people who had watched, listened, and learned.